The First Crusade had its roots, weirdly enough, in something called the Peace and Truce of God movement, which was an initiative by the clergy to try and stop Christians killing Christians, which they were really good at in the 11th century with various wars and looting and border raids. This was a bit embarrassing to the clergy since the Christian Bible's pretty strong on the don't kill people rule. But these efforts were really hard to achieve, largely because the ruling class at the time were essentially armed thugs. They called themselves kings, dukes, and so on, but they were just armed thugs who extorted the local peasantry and constantly fought with one another. But the Pope Urban II, did get his chance in 1095, where the Byzantine Emperor Alexius called for help. Alexius having just seized his throne in a coup and found himself in the embarrassing position of being able to see Muslim positions from his capital. And so Urban decided to help Alexius strengthen his own rule and get rid of these Christians killing Christians all in one swoop by sending all of those Christians to kill Muslims instead, which he decided was much, much better and everything would be fine. And so he called for a penitential holy war to take Jerusalem. He also made a whole load of other changes, but we don't have time to go into those here. First to answer the Pope's call was Peter the Hermit, who was a hermit, but he was a very, very charismatic hermit, and so he managed to raise about 30,000 troops and non-combatants, and he took this really sizable army down the Danube, and apparently having a little bit of trouble trying to understand exactly what the Pope meant by take Jerusalem, he extorted and forcibly baptized Jewish populations across Europe, looted a town of Semlin, and was eventually escorted by the Byzantine army rapidly to Constantinople to try and stop them doing any more damage. Now, Peter himself stayed in Constantinople, but his army was rushed across to Asia Minor to one of the last remaining Byzantine forts there. Ideally, where they would not be able to cause any more harm, but that didn't stop them causing more harm. They promptly angered the local Sultanate of Rum and got slaughtered by Kilij Aslan's army, leading to the capture of that last Byzantine fortress. Next up was Count Emich. Count Emich also apparently was really confused about this make holy war on Muslim Jerusalem, and instead went around slaughtering the Jewish populations all along the Danube. By the time he reached Hungary, the Hungarian king was well aware of what he was doing and had no intention of letting him in, and scattered his army. Count Emich went home with a whole lot of Jewish loot, and a bit later he was followed by two other armies of Gottschalk and Volkmar, both of whom had pretty much the same experience and got wiped out by the Hungarians. So that's 4 armies down, a whole load of dead across Europe, and the Byzantine Empire has lost territory, so great going so far. Now in late 1096, the actual main crusade set off. A series of lords from all across Europe raised armies and set off towards Constantinople, where they gathered. All of these lords would swear fealty to Alexius, all except for one, Count Raymond of Toulouse, who was a little bit put out when the Byzantine army scattered his own army because they objected to him looting the local countryside. Now, all of these forces gathered, and with Byzantine help, the crusading army numbered about 60,000 in total, and they quickly moved and had their first success taking Nicaea, the capital of the Sultanate of Rum. That was very shortly followed by the army nearly being entirely wiped out at the Battle of Dorylaeum, where the vanguard had been separated from the bulk of the army and was assaulted by Kilij Aslan's army. The vanguard was eventually rescued, but only after 5 hours of desperate fighting. But with the main army all together, they were able to scatter Kilij Aslan, and then their only enemy crossing Asia Minor was the weather, which took a much, much bigger toll. The Crusaders starved their way across Asia Minor due to massive lack of food, leading to wonderful scenes such as dogs being used as pack animals and knights riding cows. They did fight one minor battle at Heraclea, but otherwise had little resistance. It was just after Heraclea that one of the crusading leaders, Baldwin of Boulogne, left the crusading army to do his own thing. He went off to Edessa, where he got adopted by the local Armenian ruler. He then very quickly had his newly adopted father killed and took charge of Edessa, founding the first of the Crusader states. Now, the Armenians being local Christians, this absolutely was not what the Pope had asked for, but Baldwin took it as a victory anyway. The rest of the army instead proceeded to Antioch, a major city, which they besieged on the 21st of October 1097. Now, they didn't actually have enough troops to fully encircle the city, and the locals inside did not have enough to fend off the crusading army, and so this led to months of deadlock, where the Crusaders mostly fought against supply issues while battling off various relief forces. Things reached a head in May, where the Crusaders learned of a massive army led by a man known as Koboga was on its way to relieve the siege. During this, one of the other crusading leaders, a man named Bohemond, managed to extract promises that he would get to keep the city if he could somehow take it before the Muslims arrived, and then promptly revealed that he had a perfect plan to do this that he was keeping in his back pocket. He had a traitor in the city, and so he was able to sneak in, capture a gate, and let in the entire army. Now, that wasn't the end of it. The defenders simply retreated to the citadel, and the Crusaders now found themselves besieged within the city by Koboga's army, with the citadel at the heart of it all as a siege within a siege. Things looked really, really dire, but nothing that a few miraculous visions could solve. Two different people had supposed visions at this time promising relief. One was promised to find the Holy Lance, which he promptly dug around for, found a bit of metal, proclaimed it to be the Holy Lance, and the Crusaders were desperate enough that they were happy to take this all as proof of God's favour, and so they sallied out and managed to rout Koboga's army, largely because at this point what little was left of the crusading army was a pretty elite core of hardened troops. The citadel surrendered shortly after, but then everything started to go to pot again. Alexius was on the way with a large relief force to help reinforce the Crusaders, but on his way he met deserters from the crusading army who had retreated just before the city fell. These deserters persuaded Alexius that the Crusaders were done for, and so Alexius, not wanting to get his own army wiped out, turned back. Crusaders felt this was a massive betrayal and cut off all ties with him. Around the same time, the former leader of the Crusade, the papal legate Adheimer of Lipoi, died. So this left the Crusades without a leader and without a patron, and so the bickering started. After much arguing back and forth, eventually Bohemond was given Antioch. The rest of the army then moved on and captured the city of Ma'arat, where they promptly stopped and started bickering over who would get control of that. When the actual soldiery started to dismantle the entire city, the army was forced to continue to move on. They briefly stopped by to take what would become known as Crac de Chevalier, the Templar fortress, and then moved to Acre, which they briefly besieged, but then abandoned the siege after more arguing. Now, eventually, on the 7th of June 1099, the Crusaders actually reached Jerusalem, but at this point they were down to about 10,000 men. This army was far too small to fully besiege the large city, but it didn't stop them trying to just assault it anyway, even though they only brought with them a single ladder. Now, impressively, they did manage to take the outer wall. Unfortunately, Jerusalem did have a double wall, so the Crusaders just found themselves trapped between the two walls, took heavy losses, and were forced to retreat. About a month later, they tried again, this time with actual siege equipment. Siege towers had been built from lumber brought over by the Genoese, and this second assault was successful on the 15th of July. And the Crusaders, somehow being granted this miraculous victory, of course did the only honourable and godly thing, and promptly massacred pretty much everyone within the city. The few survivors were then forced to pile the dead and burn them to stop a massive disease outbreak, and then these survivors were themselves all murdered several days later, and the second mass killing done in cold blood sent shockwaves throughout the Muslim world and would remain a rallying cry for decades to come. Now, after a little bit more bickering, eventually Godfrey of Bouillon was given the city, and he would later be crowned king of Jerusalem. This didn't end things because the Egyptians, who had control of Jerusalem beforehand, had sent an army 20,000 strong to relieve the siege. The Christians, not wanting to be caught in yet another siege, marched out, and on the 12th of August they surprised the Muslim army and scattered them. and so secured their control of Jerusalem and its immediate surroundings. Now, before news of this very improbable victory could actually reach Pope Urban, he died just days after the fall of Jerusalem, so he never knew of the results of his proclamation. And so this crusade was technically a victory. They did manage to take the city they set out for, something that would not be replicated in the vast majority of future crusades. But it wasn't an outstanding victory. What was left in the Christian hands was a small fragmented group of holdings completely surrounded by a numerically superior Muslim majority who owned major cities in between them. But of course, as we all know, they learned to put their difficulties aside and everything was happy and peaceful forever after. Or maybe not.